So I mainly I want to make this video as a bit of an addendum to the previous one I made about the Russian National Guard specialization, mainly because there was a couple of units that I forgot to mention. The first is known as the 2S-18, otherwise known as the PAT-S. This was basically supposed to be a version of the BMP-3, or at least the BMP-3 chassis was supposed to be used as a base for a 152mm howitzer. Now, because it's a BMP3 chassis and it's not especially large, I don't expect the 152mm to be large either. So what you're probably going to see is something maybe akin to like the 2S3 Akatsiya, in that you have a relatively short-barreled gun system, maybe only 3.5 kilometers, but you have a larger number of them. Maybe you'll get an upgrade for like a 3.8 kilometer gun range. Secondly, there was something called the BMMP, and this is something that I'd actually mentioned in a previous video, along with the 2S-18. It's supposed to be a BMP-3 chassis, but with the BMP-2's Bruzhok turret on it. So this is the one with the 2A42, the automatic grenade launcher, and the Cornets. However, this was apparently supposed to go to the Russian naval infantry. So maybe you can add that into the naval infantry specialization. Lastly, there's also the UR-07. This is basically, from my understanding, it's supposed to be a replacement for the UR-77 using a BMP-3 chassis. So, but it's the same type of Miklik style mine clearing vehicle. As for upgrades, you're probably not going to get many. Maybe you'll probably get the option of mounting the same ERA package that a BMP3 can mount, which would granted be a pretty solid survivability upgrade, at least compared to what the UR-77, gets. And lastly, I wanted to mention the Pantsir, specifically the Pantsir on the 8-wheeled truck chassis. Now, funny thing, I originally believed that the idea of taking the Pantsir and mounting it on the Tunguska chassis was an expedient that the developers made as a hypothetical upgrade of the Tunguska. I was wrong, and I was browsing the Wikipedia page for the Pantsir, specifically the wheeled variant. Maybe you call it the Pantsir S2 in game to try and differentiate it from the Pantsir S1. And there are multiple pictures of a Pantsir system on a tracked chassis. Come to find out, the Tunguska chassis is not a purpose-built chassis. It's a basic tracked vehicle chassis that the Soviets developed for a variety of things. The Tunguska, the Shoga, the Buk, the Cub, the Krug. I believe all of those are, if not the exact same chassis, then maybe something like related chassis. Anyway, back to the Pantsir. You could add the Pantsir on the 8-wheel chassis either to the National Guard specialization, or you could take it, you can put it in the motorized infantry specialization, and then you can move the OSA over to the National Guard specialization. The Pantsir itself probably wouldn't be all that different from the one on the Tunguska chassis, particularly price-wise, but it would be something that I have seen some people asking for, so I don't see why it would be something you really couldn't actually... So I don't see why it would be something that you couldn't actually add to the game. Lastly, I want to make a bit of a correction from a previous video. I made a mention in a previous video that the Russians developed a massive towed 420mm or 16.5-inch howitzer. This is wrong. What they actually developed was a self-propelled 16.5-inch mortar. And if you look at a picture of this thing, the barrel is hilariously long, absurdly long. It looks like you could pick this thing up by the barrel and use the chassis like a hammer. They also developed a 16-inch howitzer, also on a self-propelled chassis. And I believe the reason why these were developed were as responses to the M58 atomic cannon, otherwise known as Atomic Annie. I'm not entirely sure if they were supposed to fire nuclear shells, but the idea most certainly isn't out of the question. you could probably incorporate those in game alongside things like Atomic Annie. However, if I'm going to be entirely honest, giving them the ability to fire nuclear shells is probably a bit of a stretch. For the sake of the game, it probably isn't, but just imagine what that's going to turn gameplay into, just both sides flinging nuclear shells at each other. It's not really going to be fun or very interesting. I mean, granted, it might be fun for the people flinging the nuclear shells at everything else, but it's not going to be fun for anyone else. And if you want to add other big artillery systems in the game, you could do that without too much trouble. Although you'd have to go back in time a bit to the late 1940s/early Cold War era. For example, you've got things like the T-92/93. This was basically the U.S. Army at the end of World War II looking at their long-barreled 8-inch field gun and their massive 240mm howitzer and thinking, these things are great, they hit like absolute trucks, there's just a lovely amount of firepower, but they're incredibly slow to actually move around the battlefield. You basically need two trailers to actually move them, one just for the gun and the other for the carriage. They take a long time to emplace, and they're just a big hassle. Is there any way which we can actually make a self-propelled mount for this? And then they looked at the M26 Pershing tank, and they went, I think we can. And so that's basically what the T-92/93 is. It's an M26 Pershing chassis that I think has been lengthened and an extra road wheel added, and has been turned into a self-propelled gun system for either the 240mm howitzer, the T-92, or the long-barreled 8-inch gun, the T-93. Anyone who's played World of Tanks is probably going to be familiar with this thing. Actually, on the subject of World of Tanks, when are we going to get the T-93 in game? Honestly, think about it. If you go up the US SPG line, you have the M12 at tier 7 with two options of 6.1-inch gun. And one is just a straight basic upgrade over the other. Cool. You then get to the M40, M43. You then have two gun options, either 6.1-inch gun or an 8-inch howitzer. Neither gun is necessarily an upgrade. You can either go with the more accurate, all things being relative at least, faster firing 6.1-inch gun, or the 8-inch gun that has a bigger boom. And then you go up to the M53, M55. Same deal. You have the more accurate, relatively, and faster firing 6.1-inch gun, and then the 8-inch gun with the bigger boom. And then you get to the T-92, and all you get is just a sodding great big gun that takes forever to reload. Why can't we get the long-barreled 8-inch gun as well, as a more accurate, faster firing, well, again, all things being relative when it comes to accuracy, faster firing option for the T-92 instead of the larger 240? Come on, Wargaming! It'd be awesome! Anyway, I digress. And I suppose I could talk about things like drones and mines and barbed wire and boats and infantry being able to basically entrench themselves. If I'm going to be entirely honest, I stand by what I said before about drones and boats. With boats, you're basically going to need to completely rebuild the maps, or at least most of them. You could probably get away with something like Baltisk. You're gonna need to completely rebuild the maps. You're probably going to need to either completely rebuild the deck structure, or you're going to need to heavily modify it. So let's say you take boats and you put them in the vehicle tab, or maybe in the infantry tab as troop transports. Cool. If you expect them to be used just as much as ground vehicles, you either need to make the ground vehicles cheaper and make everything else cheaper as a result, like all other units in the game, or you run into situations where players are basically a little bit strapped for cash because they're trying to employ both ground vehicles and boats. Alternatively, you make boats their own special tab and a specialization, kind of like the special tab that you get when you have access to things like LCACs. However, one problem I see with that is each specialization has 5,000 points in it, and the total deck cost is 10,000 points. If you make a special tab for any specialization, unless you all want to give them the exact same amount of points for boats, you're going to mess with the amount of points that you have depending on the specialization combination. So basically what I mean is, let's say you have 3 specializations, right? Two of them have 500 points, one of them has 750 points in a sort of like a special boat tab. You put two of them together, you get 1,000 boat points. You make another combination, you get 1,250 boat points. This is not equal, particularly if you add this onto the already extant 10,000 points. So you run into balancing issues like that. The reason why I mention the idea of a special boat tab is because if you want to keep the basic maps in the game, and the developers are probably going to want to do that because they spent a lot of time making these maps, you're probably going to want to keep them in the rotation, and as I said, they aren't very conducive to boats. Heck, there are some of them where I don't even think there is water on the map at all. So on those maps, you wouldn't get the boat tab. And the problem, of course, is that if you did that, you couldn't really just fold boats into the basic organizational structure of the deck because you're not going to be using them. If you take a player that has, say, all their infantry assigned to transport boats, and they go and they play a map that has no water whatsoever, well, they're just out of luck. And okay, sure, you can make an argument that you have different decks that you could select from and all that. But is that really a good enough argument? I mean, I suppose it would be for some, and to be fair, I can see the merits of it. But on top of everything else, like with adjusting all the maps and stuff, and basically making entirely new maps, I don't see boats being added to the game for a very long time. At least not outside of certain mission-specific options, like how you get the LCAC or the Zuber in different campaign missions. In campaign missions, I can certainly see how they can work, but that's a campaign mission. Again, and scenarios are very similar. I can see how that can work, but in actual multiplayer, that's going to be pretty difficult. As for drones, if I'm going to be entirely honest, I don't really see drones being added to the game. And I know I've already said that, and I stand by what I said. And to be clear, when I say drones, I'm talking about small UAS, quadcopters, hand-launched, things like that. I can kind of understand why people want them in the game. I mean, they're certainly making headlines over in Ukraine. But if you put them in the game, they're going to change the way the gameplay works to such a ridiculous degree that it's basically going to change the way the entire game is played. And you can make an argument that drones are doing exactly that in Ukraine, but this is a game. This isn't supposed to be a simulator for real-world combat. So I understand why the devs would be hesitant to add things like small drones in game. And that's not even taking into account what you can argue to be the challenges mechanically. Like, how do you make the small drones as a unit work? I suppose maybe it'll be something like you could tell an infantry unit to launch a drone and they sort of produce a new unit that you can grab and you can move around. At the same time, if you do that, that's probably going to give you a lot of units to control, particularly if each infantry unit can launch multiple drones. So you're probably going to reach a point where the player is basically overloaded. And I know that developers don't want to add anything like that, because not long before the game came out, there were some people arguing that yes, the Russian military is crap and they should be crap in game, but you should counterbalance them being crap by just giving players a lot of units to use. And the developers basically said that while we could do that, that would give the people playing Russia a lot of things that they would need to micromanage, and we don't want to do that. And you run into the exact same problem here, I think. Not to mention that one of the reasons why drones would change the gameplay so much is because we don't have electronic warfare in game. The sole reason why drones are not running rampant across the Ukrainian battlefield right now is just because of the sheer amount of electronic warfare that Russia and Ukraine have. Electronic warfare is by far the single most effective counter to drones at all. So if you're going to incorporate drones, and you can make an argument that okay, sure, but there's tethered drones which are going to be completely immune to electronic warfare. But if you incorporate tethered drones, you would have to incorporate some system where they can't go farther than X distance from the unit that launched them or whatnot. but you would have to incorporate electronic warfare if you're actually going to make drones not just dominate. At least if you're trying to make the game similar to what you see in Ukraine. And if I'm going to be entirely honest, if you want to make the game similar to what you see in Ukraine, you run the risk of basically overlearning the lessons that the Ukraine war has to teach. And this I think is actually pretty dangerous for anyone watching the war in Ukraine, because sure, you can make an argument that it's a great place to see how modern warfare is going to be, but you have to be concerned about overlearning the lessons that are in Ukraine. If you want to, like, sure, having small one-way attack drones is going to be important, but that doesn't mean that you should cancel your next generation tank and strategic bomber programs in order to purchase several hundred million small one-way attack drones. Another thing I wanted to mention is basically mines, trenches, and barbed wire. If I'm going to be entirely honest, I don't think mines would be that hard to actually implement in the game. I suppose you could do it kind of similar to the way cluster works. However, it's worth noting that before I get into all of this, that the reason why the developers do not want anything like mines or trenches in the game is because they don't want to slow gameplay down. And if I'm going to be entirely honest, it's already hard enough to actually attack in game, with things like infantry anti-tanks teams, and you can hide infantry in buildings in forests, and they're pretty common, so you can have them spread around. But with things like infantry anti-tank teams, anti-tank guided missile vehicles, helicopters, artillery, and aircraft, trying to attack into a well-defended area is already a nightmare. And then if you incorporate things like mines, you're already going to make it even more difficult. That said, I think there's a way that they could at least do it. One way which they could do it is they could treat it kind of like cluster. The idea is that you have, and this would particularly work with something like artillery deployed mines, is that you deploy mines in an area. Maybe the mines have like a 5 or 10 second grace period to arm, so that you can't just drop the mines on top of enemy infantry or vehicles. And then the mines last for something like 3 minutes. So you can't just lay a bunch of minefields and then organize your infantry around them and then just go walk away and eat lunch. You still need to play the game. And I specified that you put your infantry around them, because a minefield or obstacles do not stop the enemy. Only a watched minefield or watched obstacles do. So, because if they're not watched, then the other guy could just come up and clear the minefield or clear the obstacles without much of an issue. But if they're watched, that's when things really get tough. You could deploy the mines that way, or maybe you could use things like helicopters and ground vehicles in order to deploy mines. Both the US and Russia have helicopter deployed mine systems, and I know the US has a ground vehicle deployed mine system as well. So you could potentially do something like that, at the very least, to actually deploy the mines. As for how you would clear the mines, if I'm going to be entirely honest, the only experience I have with any mine clearing in game is in a game called Regiments that I tried out during the spring of this year when I was jonesing for Broken Arrow. In Regiments, granted it wasn't mines, it was obstacles in general, but any unit could clear an obstacle. So maybe in game any unit could clear a minefield. However, and when I say any unit could clear a minefield, I don't mean that the unit clears the minefield using the Guardian method of mine clearing. Step 1, step on mine. Step 2, wait for ghost revival. Step 3, step on second mine, and so on and so forth. I'm not talking about like that. I'm talking about the unit approaches the minefield and then waits, and then you have to wait a certain amount of time for the unit to clear the minefield. Maybe this wouldn't work for armored vehicles. Maybe it would only work for things like infantry. But then you would have engineering vehicles and combat engineers, or engineering infantry rather, that would be better at clearing minefields, that could clear them faster. So, and this would also buff, at least in my opinion, things like combat engineers and mech engineers and their associated ESV variants, because if I'm going to be entirely honest, I was very confused about why they were in the game when I first got the game. And I understand now that they're basically like CQB infantry, but I was still very confused when I initially got the game. But the idea is that you could use engineers to help clear minefields faster than regular infantry. Maybe engineering vehicles like the Bradley ESV, the Stryker ESV, and the Assault Breacher can also clear mines in the same way that infantry can. And then you would have things like Mikliks, which could just clear a minefield or at least clear a path through a minefield instantly. And you can make the argument that this is basically just buffing the US and it would make the US OP and whatnot. And I can understand that. And to be entirely honest, everything I mentioned strictly applies to the United States. The combat engineers, mech engineers, US units, the Bradley ESV, Stryker ESV, Assault Breacher, US units. The Mikliks, the US has two different Mikliks, the Assault Breacher and the AAVP. Russia only has one, the UR-77. However, you can counterbalance this by giving Russia basically more mines, because Russia has a lot of different types of mines. They have a lot of different types of mine deploying systems. As for minefields themselves, I suppose you could have things like anti-personnel mines or anti-vehicle mines, or you might even have the option of making a minefield that has both anti-personnel and anti-vehicle mines in it. Also, for the sake of it, I don't know if things like the Cat Fay, the Toss, or the Souffle that I mentioned could also clear mines, but I'm erring on the side of no, because that wouldn't really make any sense. I suppose you can make an argument that the Cat Fay and the Souffle could, mainly because that's what they were initially designed for, but the Toss is not designed for that. The Toss is just designed to throw massive thermobaric or incendiary rockets into fortified areas. And for the sake of minefields, you could also argue for adding maybe to something like the light infantry specialization that I mentioned for the US, an M58 Miklik launch trailer that's just towed behind something like an MRAP. As for barbed wire, I don't really see barbed wire making it into the game at all. I mean, you could make it into the game, and I suppose you could be used to slow down infantry and some vehicles and maybe damage infantry along the way, but how would it really work? I'm not saying it would be hard, but what I'm saying is that it would be kind of pointless. Because firstly, you would need a way to spread it. You could, and there'd be a variety of ways which you can use to get through barbed wire, and I just don't think it would actually be worth it. Aside from the things I already mentioned about slowing down gameplay. Lastly, and this is the thing that I think is really interesting, would probably be the ability to allow infantry to actually entrench. And the idea is that you might have a command maybe similar to something like Sprint, where you can tell the infantry to basically dig in and entrench, and they wouldn't receive any stealth bonuses from entrenching, but they would receive something akin to a cover bonus from like being inside of a building. Actually, on that subject, is there any cover bonus that's provided to infantry in forests? I'd assume not, and if I'm going to be entirely honest, with the kind of weaponry that gets thrown around in this game, a tree's not going to stop a 30mm AP FSDS round. So, or, well, we're talking about infantry, so a tree's probably not going to stop a 30mm HE round either. So I don't really expect that you actually would get any cover bonus from being inside a forest. If I'm going to be entirely honest, I'm not sure you would actually get any concealment bonus from being inside a forest either, at least not in real life. With the kind of optics that modern weapon systems are equipped with, you're probably not going to get much concealment from being inside of a forest. And you're also probably not going to know that you've been spotted until you've been killed. However, it's clear that the developers have taken a lot of steps in-game to make infantry more survivable, and I just suppose that's one of them. Anyway, I digress. I just wanted to make this little addendum.